Hello, I'm Dale, and these are my books. Today we're going to be speaking about one of my favorite books, and it's Don Quixote. And you can see Don Quixote is written by somebody called Miguel de Cervantes. The this is going to be a video about giving some hints on how to read Don Quixote to overcome the fear which might come from reading a novel which is so long. And so I'm going to be discussing how I can leave great chunks out and why you should read it. Don Quixote is, first of all, the basis of modern Western literature. It's regarded as the first novel. It was written in two volumes, 1605 and 1615. So why is it the first novel? It's the first novel because it has a novel structure and it has characters which interact and which play with each other. So you might think of some other stories. You might think of the Iliad or the Odyssey, going back to ancient Greece. These weren't novels, they were actually poetry, so they don't quite count as novels. And you might think that novels are just stories, and a really good example of this is Boccaccio's Decameron, which was written in the 1300s, but it's not considered a novel. And the reason why the Decameron is not considered a novel is because it's a story about some young men and women in the mid-1300s in Florence, and because of the Great Plague, the pestilence of 1348, they decide to leave the city in order to seek some sort of safety. So they leave the city, and then they tell each other short stories. And so it's one short story after another, and at the end of the novel, at the end of the story, there's a resolution. Now, it's not really a novel because the characters are all fairly black and white. They're all very two-dimensional, and there's no development of the characters along the way. There's no overarching story. And so this idea of there being a plague, that they have to leave Florence, and then they tell each other stories, this is really a so-called framing device for bringing together lots of short stories. Don Quixote is different to that, because although there are what could appear to be lots of short stories or lots of adventures, as they're called in the novel, along the way, the novel focuses on essentially two characters. One is a character called Don Quixote, and Don Quixote is a man who is getting on in age. He's pushing 50. He's not very rich. He owns a small farm. He has a housekeeper. He has a niece. He has a boy who helps out. And he reads so many books about knights that he goes mad, and he thinks that he himself should become a knight. And immediately we get a joke here. The joke is that Don Quixote isn't 25 and really buffed, but rather he's middle-aged, he's almost old, he is very skinny, and he is not skilled in fighting and in martial arts or in the skills of being a knight at all. But he decides he needs to become a knight not only for his own honour, but for the good of his country. Spain needs more knights, and so he decides to become a knight. He then gets on his horse, and instead of his horse being this amazing stallion, it is in fact a very old horse. It's a very clapped out horse. It's a nag, and in fact it's so old and so decrepit that it can't even get up a full gallop. So Don Quixote gets on this very old horse, and he decides that as a knight he needs a helper, he needs a squire. And instead of a squire being a person who's normally a trainee knight, what this man is he's just a local farm worker. And so Don Quixote employs this guy as his squire. Squires are normally trainee knights, they're knights in training, learning on the job, and this guy is physically not much of a knight either. He's actually very short and he's very fat. This guy's name is Sancho Panza, and Panza is related to the English word paunch, meaning fat. And you can see the comedic contrast between the two characters. You have the tall, skinny guy, and you have the short, fat guy, and they go off on their adventures. What makes this a novel is that along the way, the characters of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza slightly change, and that is Don Quixote um, becomes more and more cynical about this idea of being a knight. And in fact, towards the end, he realizes that he's spent a great deal of his time just being mad, and he's not a knight at all. And he apologizes to Sancho Panza. And Sancho, on the other hand, really quite likes gallivanting around Spain, getting involved in these adventures. And rather than being the cynical character, the down-to-earth character that he has been throughout all the novel, he now really wants to keep going. He really wants to keep this double act going and having adventures around about Spain. So that's an outline of the novel. And in between, there are lots and lots of adventures. And a lot of these adventures can be cut out, can be omitted, and you still get the gist of what the novel is about. And we'll come back to that, about what you can leave out if reading this book is too intimidating. It's about 1,000 pages, and that's why, unfortunately, a lot of people find it intimidating and they don't read it, which I think is a great shame. There are two main translations of Don Quixote. The original was written in Spanish, of course, and the translations into English, there are essentially two of them. There is one by John Ormsby, and there's another one by Edith Grossman, which is this translation. The Edith Grossman translation is not my preference. It's a much more modern translation in modern English. However, it's very easy to find. If you go into a bookshop and ask for a copy of Don Quixote, the Edith Grossman translation is almost always the one you find. However, I do have a preference for the Ormsby translation. Ormsby did his translation into Victorian English, and there's a certain sophistication and a certain antique nature to the language, which I really like, and I think it comes across much better than the Grossman translation. Getting a hard copy of this is relatively difficult to find. However, it is available for free on Project Gutenberg, and it's also the translation that Audible.com uses in their audio version of Don Quixote. The audio translation by Audible, by the way, is absolutely fantastic. Really great reading. If you're reading the Ormsby translation and you're listening to it on Audible, there are sometimes paragraphs which go missing for some reason. So if you lose focus and miss a paragraph, it's not you, it's the Audible production. Just to give a hint of the difference between the Ormsby and the Grossman translations, at the very beginning of the book, there is a famous opening, and it starts, "In a village of La Mancha, the name of which I have no desire to call to mind, there lived not long since one of those gentlemen that keep a lance in the lance rack, an old buckler, a lean hack, and a greyhound for coursing." That's the Ormsby translation, and you can see it begins, "In a village of La Mancha, the name of which I have no desire to call to mind." The Grossman translation, on the other hand, is "somewhere in La Mancha, in a place whose name I do not care to remember." And I think that this language just sounds a little bit too romance-based and a little bit clinical, and I just prefer the Ormsby translation. This brings us to a point which I think is very important with Don Quixote, and that is that you have to expect a joke in almost every paragraph. Otherwise, you can be reading stuff and it just doesn't really make sense. So in the very first sentence of the book, the novel says, "In a village of La Mancha, the name of which I have no desire to call to mind. This is conveying the narrator as someone who is talking about a village in La Mancha, which is a region of Spain, but the village is so inconsequential and so unimportant, he can't even be bothered remembering its name. And this happens throughout the entire book. There's a joke in almost every paragraph. So you have to sort of be clued in to be expecting those jokes. At the beginning of the book, there's a bunch of poetry, and I suggest for a first reading, just ignore it. It doesn't add anything really to the story. Just goes straight to the opening line, in a village of La Mancha. And then you can go through with that. It's a long book, it's 1,000 pages, as I've said, and you may be intimidated by that. So what I would suggest you do, essentially, is read the first 8 chapters, and then skip all of the middle, and then read the last 150 pages. That will give you the gist of the book. What the first 8 chapters does is that it introduces Don Quixote, it shows how he goes mad, it introduces the character Sancho Panza. They get together and they go off on their adventures, and adventure after adventure is what happens for the rest of the book. Importantly, one of the first adventures is that both of them are on their respective horses, and in the far distance there are some windmills. And Don Quixote is very excited about this, because this is one of the first adventures. Because the windmills, in his own diseased mind, are not really windmills at all. They're giants. And he, Don Quixote, is going to lift up his lance, and he's going to charge these giants and defeat them in single combat. Because obviously these giants are somehow demons, they're somehow supernatural evil entities. Sancho Panza says to Don Quixote, no, 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 master, they're not giants, they're windmills. And then Don Quixote becomes very supercilious and says, oh, you know so little about being a knight, they're obviously giants. And in fact, the sails on the windmills that are moving because there's a gentle breeze, these are not sails at all, but these are actually the arms of the giants. So Don Quixote charges, his lance gets stuck into one of the sails, it tosses him onto the ground, and then the adventure goes on. I'm just mentioning this particular adventure because it gives us a couple of expressions in English. One is the expression tilting at windmills, and the word tilting actually means the same as charging, and so this is a reference to Don Quixote charging at windmills, and it means, of course, to take on some sort of enterprise which cannot possibly be done successfully, but which is all pie in the sky. And of course this book also gives us the English word quixotic, which means exactly the same. There is another adventure which happens very early in the book where Don Quixote arrives at a hotel, and he thinks in his own diseased imagination that this hotel is obviously a castle, and that the women standing outside the castle must be ladies of the castle. They must be daughters of the local landowner, the person who owns the castle. And so he arrives, and he's in his armour, and these ladies of the castle, the women standing outside of the pub door, are a little alarmed, because here's this guy who's turned up wearing armour, and he has a lance. He eventually gets off to the horse, he goes up to the women, and it's explained that these ladies of the windmill are not actually ladies at all. They're a certain type of women, and the hint there is that they're prostitutes. And so when he refers to these women as my fair ladies, my maidens, they find this hilarious, and they start laughing like anything. I think it's a funny scene, but you have to be aware of it. These funny scenes are happening almost all the time. So what I suggest you do is read the first 8 chapters. If you're time pressed, if you have the time, read everything. It's a great novel. I love it. But if you're time pressed, read the first 8 chapters and then read the last 150 pages. And the last 150 pages means you cover a few more adventures, and then you go through what I think is actually a very moving scene where Don Quixote comes to his senses and he realizes that he has been going through a period of madness, and he regrets that. He regrets that he's wasted that part of his life, and moreover, he apologizes to Sancho. I am so sorry that I've been leading you on these wild goose chases and that I've wasted your time. Um, but that's it. And he's on his deathbed, and Sancho says to him, in a beautiful phrase, just a fantastic phrase, "Don't die, master." And the reading of this on Audible is just fantastic. It is heartbreaking to see that both Sancho and Don Quixote have realized that all of their adventures have been fantastic, but it has come to this sad scene at last. And then Don Quixote dies. It's a great novel. So that's what I would recommend. I would recommend the Ormsby translation. Read the beginning and the end of the book if you're time pressed, but do, if you can, read the whole thing because it is fun and it's very easy to read. And also listen to the audible.com production if you can. And I hope this has helped with your reading Don Quixote.